Welcome to JonathanKing15. As you may remember, I'd met Brian Epstein when I was going around the world endeavouring to be a star, and he was terribly nice. And of course he was one of the very many people who I'd met beforehand who was delighted when I actually had a hit record. And I was able to mix and mingle with him on his own kind of level. And I used to see him all the time. In fact, we regularly had lunch and we were very good friends. We became very good friends. But I remember when we used to go down to the clubs, and I was down at the clubs almost every night. In fact, I don't remember for several years ever going to bed before the sun had risen. So I was there enjoying the party. And I remember one night, it was about 5 in the morning. And I was there with, I remember Kit Lambert, who used to manage The who I knew very well. And he was always quite amusing. He used to look around at about 4 in the morning and say, "I'm getting desperate, it's 4 in the morning," and would pick somebody up who was most unsuitable. And I would say, "Kit, no, you're going to regret it." And sure enough, the next day he called me and said, "Oh, it was a terrible mistake, but it was 4 in the morning." Anyway, Brian Epstein and I were there amongst other people, and I'd been dancing on the dance floor, and I got very hot and I'd taken my shirt off and I was sitting down next to him, naked from the waist up. And Brian looked at me and he said, "Jonathan, do you know you've probably got the best body of anyone in the business?" And then he paused and said, "Pity about the face." Well, you can see what he means, can't you? I, of course, roared with laughter. He looked horrified at what he said. "Oh, my God, I can't believe I said that. That's so awful. Will you ever forgive me?" I said, "Brian, I can't tell you how relieved I am. I don't want you, please, under that sort of relationship." And I was very upset when Brian died, because I'd actually had lunch with him a couple of days before in the King's Road. We always used to go to the same restaurant, and I used to sit with my back to the window and he used to sit on the other side, and every now and again he'd suddenly glaze off like this. And I used to say, "Brian, will you come back down to earth?" And I used to think to myself, it's the drugs. But I realised it wasn't the drugs. I said to him, "Why do you keep going?" And he said, "I keep seeing beautiful young men walking down King's Road." Anyway, Brian had had lunch with me on Thursday and tried really hard to persuade me to go down to his country house at the weekend, because he said there's nobody else around. The Beatles and everyone were in India, and he said, "I'm going to be so bored and I'll be so lonely. Please come down." And I said, "Brian, I've got lots to do. I can't possibly come down there. You'll enjoy yourself. You'll have a wonderful time." And then, of course, the tragedy was he died. I think he went down there and I think he came back to London, took a drug overdose accidentally. Of that I can be absolutely certain, because I'd seen him 24 hours earlier and there wasn't a suicidal bone in his body. He was enjoying himself enormously. But I'm afraid he mixed too many drugs and actually ended up dying. I was terribly upset, because he was the first real genuine close friend I'd had who had died, and I was still only 20 or something, and it really did upset me. Also in the clubs, I used to mix a lot with Jane Asher, who was Paul McCartney's girlfriend at the time, and Cynthia Lennon, who was John Lennon's wife. The main reason being they're both sweet, lovely girls, but neither of them did drugs either. So the three of us who were completely non-druggies would sit there while everyone else was stoned out of their mind, and we were going, "What on earth are they talking about? They're completely out of it." I remember one particularly amusing time down at the Cromwellian, I think it was, or one of those clubs. George Harrison was there, and he was obviously very stoned, and George was a terribly nice man, and he was rambling on with the most incredible rubbish you've ever heard, and all of a sudden he stopped and looked at me, and he'd obviously come down to earth, and he said, "I've been talking nothing but bullshit." And I said, "Yes, George, exactly." And he roared with laughter and didn't have any worries about it at all. John Lennon was really probably the guy I was closest to in the Beatles, and I used to see quite a lot of him. We were very good friends. He had a wicked, acid sense of humour, and he could be so rude to somebody if he didn't like them. But if he enjoyed their company and liked them, he got on fine with them, and I liked him a lot. I thought it was great fun. And I remember one night we were down at a club and Cynthia wasn't there, and John and I were chattering away, and he wasn't as stoned as he could be. And there were a couple of very attractive girls, and John said, "Oh, let's chat," and we chatted. Anyway, we ended up going back to my flat, which was the only place we could go, because Cynthia was at his home, which was in St Andrew's Mansions, the two of us and the two girls, and we got there and we ensconced ourselves in one of the bedrooms, and unfortunately it turned out the two girls were far more interested in each other than they were in me or John. So me and John made whatever we could. It was quite a nice time, just let me put it like that. We had no problems. John was a wonderful man who I remember at one point was completely high on something called STP, which was like LSD, but it used to make you go shooting up and disappearing for 20 minutes and coming back down again exactly the same as when you'd left. And it was rather disconcerting because we'd have a conversation and I'd say something to him and he'd say, "Oh yes, Jonathan, you're quite right. The point is," and then he'd be gone. And for 20 minutes I'd have a lovely conversation with Cynthia or Jane or someone, and then he'd say, "What you really need to do is," and I'd realise he was back at exactly the point he'd been beforehand. And I actually remember the discussion we've been having, because we've been talking about how we both made records and how we both created hits. And we both admitted that we had a record we really loved and we listened to it a million times, we learnt it, we used it and the theme and the feel of it, and then we would adapt it and we'd take the bits of it that we liked and we'd make a new song with new lyrics and work on it that way. And it was actually a very interesting conversation. But I also remember at one point he said, "Jonathan, you'd like to be me, wouldn't you?" And I said, "No, John, I'm really happy being me." And we had this 2-hour discussion. I couldn't convince him I wouldn't be happier being John Lennon. And I kept trying to and say, "John, I'm doing perfectly well, thank you very much, as Jonathan King. No, no, you want to be me." But we did remain very good friends right up to the end of his life. In fact, I was due to be having lunch with him the week after he died, sadly.